I've made something like 10 scenes on the channel so far, so I think we should discuss how you can go about picking colors. We'll be doing it by coloring this black and white scene. This is a video for beginners, but I'm going to be using the words hue, value, and saturation a lot in this video. Hue refers to the color we pick, saturation is the intensity of the color, and value refers to how dark or bright the color is. Our first step is to ask ourselves what type of asset this scene has. So it's set in a forest, so we know it has trees, some foliage, some rocks, and some sky. So our intuition should tell us to use colors such as green, brown, blue, and gray. I want us to start with assuming that we don't know anything about colors. So we'll go ahead and just pick a brown, a blue, and a gray. And it doesn't look so good. But it's not the end of the world. If we just reduce the saturation and change the color of the green a bit to a more pleasant green. Now the scene maybe looks a bit quirky, but it definitely has a vibe, and you might actually like it. This scene mostly looks terrible because of the green, which is a difficult color to work with. Many artists actually avoid it altogether, but you still might not like the vibe of this. And in order to understand why, I think we should look at a few things. So we go back to square one, and before we pick our colors, we ask ourselves one more question. What mood and atmosphere do we want our scene to have? Let's just say we want it to be a dark and moody night. The reason we ask this question is that it can help us answer what type of blue and what type of green we want to use. We want it to be a dark and moody day or night, so we want colder colors. This concept might be tricky if you haven't encountered it before, but it honestly isn't that tricky. You can get a rough estimate for what is considered cold and warm by looking at charts like these. Essentially, red and yellow are considered quite warm, whereas like purple and blue is considered a bit colder. So if we need a color such as green and we want it to be a moody day, we want to pick a green that is quite close to blue because that makes it colder. Conversely, if you wanted to do the opposite, we would pick a green that was closer to yellow and that would make it warmer. And so we do this for all colors. So if you go for brown, we want a brown with a bit more purple in it rather than yellow because the purple is slightly closer to blue, so it's slightly colder. For our gray, which gray is gray, we can actually add a bit of blue into it. So we get a blue-gray, still very unsaturated, there's very little color in it. But the little color that we add, we make it blue. In this case, we can actually think about one more thing, which is that since it's a dark and moody day, we probably want quite low saturation. Why? Well, think about it. If it's a dark and rainy day, those almost always look sort of gray and dull and dead. So we kind of want to replicate that. So on top of picking sort of a colder brown, we can also desaturate it quite a bit. Same for the green and the blue. Compared to the previous scene, this looks much better. The reason is that when we pick these colors, we ensure to find something that unites them. In this case, they're quite unsaturated and they're quite cold. And that makes them feel like they belong to the same space. But I want us to do a bit more just to get a feel for this. Suppose that instead of saying that we wanted a dark and cold day, we wanted more of a sunny and warm and fuzzy day. To create that, we should obviously then go to warmer colors, those that you might actually find on a warm and sunny day. So now we essentially start on the opposite end. When we pick a brown, pick one with more yellow into it. When we pick a green, we also pick one with more yellow. When we pick gray, maybe we pick one with more orange into it, or yellow works fine too. Whatever color I have, if I want it to be cold, I push it towards blue. And if I want it to be warm, I'm pushing it to yellow. For blue, to represent the sky, it becomes a bit more about association. So like when I think about a sky on a warm sunny day, I kind of think of light blue or maybe turquoise skies. And then for all of this, maybe we push the saturation a bit more. And then we color all of this and we get something like this. How about if you just wanted a mystical and enchanted forest? Well, here I would just go about picking colors that don't look natural. Violet, teal, purple, maybe blue. If we were looking at the colors we picked, they're still in the kind of cold range. So we can actually limit ourselves to that. And if you place everything in, maybe this looks kind of trippy, but that's largely because we still have kind of normal assets. And we've just shifted the colors. We really don't have any mystical elements. But even for this scene, if we were to add just a bit of particle effects, we could make it kind of cool, but we're still just playing around. But obviously, if you wanted to make it more mystical and enchanted, I would first create assets that sort of remind me of that. And I think I have 3 or 4 scenes where I wanted to get that more mystical type of vibe. And you can see how the colors I picked sort of reflect that. If we look back at our first bad attempt, we solved it by pulling down the saturation on the assets. So we essentially took really bad colors that weren't connected at all and united them by adding some limitation, in this case, low saturation. So while you might often see advice such as pick a good color palette, I personally think that if you're new, rather than picking colors from a palette, you can get quite far with limiting your palette in some way. This doesn't mean that you can't unite warm and cold colors and that it won't look cool if you do, or sort of picking complementary colors or stuff like that. I still think you can get quite far with limiting your palette in some way, such as low saturation or picking colder colors or warmer colors. So now we have covered a bit about how to pick colors for your entire scene. I think we should discuss a bit how you can pick colors for a specific asset. But I'll say this again, your grayscale often matters much more than the colors you choose. You want to ensure that your underlying values and your underlying grayscale looks good. If your scene is difficult to read in grayscale, it'll probably look bad and be difficult to read when you add colors on top of it. And I can't show it quite appropriately here. I would have to purposely make bad assets to begin with, and that will be for another video. But you can kinda see if I mess some of them up, they will just look slightly worse. Just trust me that it can be honestly good to check your scene once in a while in grayscale. And if you have a good grayscale underneath, it probably won't look too bad when you pick colors. With that said, I would generally say that it can be good to avoid highly saturated colors. And I'll give you 2 reasons for this. First of all, if I were to pick 2 different colors of the same value, so they're equally dark, and then I increase the saturation for both of them and go over to grayscale, now you can see that they're actually differently dark or differently bright. So even though they look like they have the same value, they very much don't. So the more saturated your color is, the harder it's going to be to get the correct value, and your value matters. So how dark a color will be when you increase the saturation depends sort of on the hue of the color. So blue gets very dark, whereas a high saturation yellow is still very bright, which is the reason why all my thumbnails have this bright yellow color, because it has good contrast, making it more readable and hopefully more clickable. So if we look at the color graph, it's probably better being on this end of the spectrum instead of this one. The second reason I think it can be good to use less saturated colors is that they naturally have quite a bit of unity between them and look like they belong together, because they all contain quite a bit of gray. You might have noticed in regards to our first moody scene that this color looks kind of warm. It looks kind of yellow, and it is. That is because I used some small tricks that I've mentioned in the past. The first trick is that I think you can get away with using slightly more saturated shadows. The second trick is to use cold shadows and warm highlights. You can do this for either a cold scene or a warm scene. So this first scene is a cold scene with warm highlights. But if you look at this one has quite cold shadows, but it's an overall quite warm scene. This kind of makes sense if you think about it. The sun gives off warm, bright light, and shadows don't get as much sunlight, so they generally tend to get a bit colder. We can compare here and see what it does. If we simply stay on the same saturation and only change the values, then the asset will look like this. But if we start increasing the saturation for our shadows and reducing the saturation for our highlights, the asset will look like this. And if we take it one step further and make our shadows slightly colder and our highlights slightly warmer, then the assets will look like this. And if we compare all 3 versions, we get this. In my opinion, these small changes can make quite a big difference in how your overall asset or scene looks. Because of this, I personally think that if you're new, it can be helpful to draw your highlights, your shadows, and your base color on 3 separate layers. Not necessarily because it's a good approach to painting overall, but that way you can go into adjustments and something called HSL. That way you can play around with each layer separately and see what difference it makes and what looks best to you. It can kind of help you correct things more easily. So if we do this for our entire scene and we keep the saturation and hue consistent for each asset, then we get something like this. It's not too bad. It kind of looks cool. But now if we shift our shadows to become slightly colder and our highlights to become slightly warmer, we get something like this. Hopefully you agree with me that it does make a difference. You might still prefer one over the other, but quite often it can make your scene feel slightly less flat, and it's quite an easy trick to use. For this scene at least, it kind of reminds me of warm moonlight, and it sets a different vibe or tone for the scene. And I think it makes the scene look a bit less flat. And we're only making small changes here, so it doesn't really require that much effort or that much work. It isn't necessarily perfect, but it is quite a neat trick that will lead to quite decent results most of the time. One thing that is quite specific to game art is that you often want to color code your platforms differently from the background to set them apart. You can see this quite often in games, and one of the more obvious ones is Jump King, where platforms such as this one is a bit brighter and slightly more saturated compared to the rest of the background. This doesn't necessarily look the best, but gameplay wise it reads extremely clearly. So you often see a lot of games do this. Have each platform be a bit higher contrast and a bit visually distinct from the background. And this brings me to my biggest belief overall in terms of color and game art. We use it to communicate something. It's important to always think about what we want to communicate and how we best communicate that thing. We want to communicate where our platforms are because it aids gameplay. And the best way to do that is to make them visually distinct. But we also want to communicate an idea or a mood with our art. So we need to figure out how to best communicate that idea. Because if you don't have a clear visual identity and a clear messaging, your game can easily lose a bit of that impact. Not to say that any of this is easy and that you or I will ever achieve it, but it's still something to strive for. So suppose you draw all your assets and you put them into your scene and it looks horrible. What do? Depending on how bad it looks, you might actually have to go back and adjust the assets themselves. I often upload and set up my scene way before I think I'm done. So just for this scene that I set up now, I have 12 versions. It can quite often be difficult to see this type of background work. It's not like artists just naturally get everything right on the first try. It might look like that in a video like this. What I mean is that you kind of have to accept that none of this is easy, even when you get better. And you need to just try and see the fun in it. And honestly, even when your assets do actually look good, your scene might still look a bit off. And I've shown this multiple times on my channel before, where we have everything set up, but we still need to add some separation in between our layers to increase that depth in our scene. And here we need to often play around with the separation between our layers with things such as particle effects and shaders. My main prescription is just to have some fun and don't use green. I talk a bit more about how to set up your scene in this video,